Hello, here is Javire Shafiq, and today I am going to make you all familiar with one of the most famous philosophers of 20th century named Albert Camus. So here is the outline which I will cover in this video. Number 1, Introduction of Albert Camus. Number 2, his famous works. Number 3, his philosophy of absurdism. Number 4, his major concepts about the absurd, the revolt, and the rebel. And then in the end, I will conclude my whole video. So let's delve into the life and philosophy of Albert Camus. One of the biggest human dilemmas is our deep urge or quest for meaning in life. When you ask the universe for meaning, it doesn't answer. It is like you spend your entire life writing letters to someone who never replies. At the core of every human being, there is this desire for meaning, but the world doesn't care. Philosophers have tried to come up with good answers. One of the most logical answers has been nihilism, which means there is no meaning or purpose, the art of nothingness. Then the question arises why we are living if life has no meaning. Yet we all do, 99.9% of us continue living. So, what is actually going on? Of course, some thinkers like Dostoevsky returned to religion and tradition as a response to nihilism. But what about the rest of us? And then came Albert Camus. The Algerian French novelist and philosopher, however, offered an alternative to both religion and nihilism that applies to the majority of us. He argued that life is absurd, meaningless, contradictory, and it sucks. However, despite its meaninglessness, absurdity, and contradictions, we grow to love life. Why? To answer this, Camus, just like his mentor Nietzsche, returned to pre Christian ancient Greece for an answer. Nietzsche argued that religions, Christianity in particular, had corrupted the human mind by obsessing over and giving priority to afterlife. As a result, we neglect this life, always thinking grass is greener in heaven. While Nietzsche said ancient Greeks valued this life despite believing in an afterlife. So now let's start our main topic of today's presentation and let's seek the answer from the philosophy of Albert Camus. Basically, Albert Camus' philosophy offers a solution to the meaning of life for the ordinary people. So first of all, we will discuss his personal life and then later his philosophy. Albert Camus was born on 7th November 1913 in Algeria to a French family. His father died a year later during World War I, leaving Camus' mother to care for him and his brother. They lived in a poor neighborhood of the capital at his grandma and disabled uncle. At primary school, he met a teacher who helped him get a scholarship to enter a prestigious school in 1923. About 30 years later, in his Nobel Prize speech, Camus dedicated the prize to that same teacher. Despite his working class background, his European heritage allowed him certain privileges like good education, enrollment in a football club that were not available to most local Arab Algerians. But when it comes to health, there is no privilege. In 1930, Camus, aged 17, contracted two tuberculosis, which put an abrupt stop to his education and football career. So he moved out of his family home to avoid infecting others and went to live with his butcher uncle. For Camus, the isolation, but most crucially, the illness, as well as seeing animals being killed to feed people, gave him a sharp existential focus about the nature of life, so he became deeply interested in philosophy, specifically the pessimistic philosophy of Schopenhauer and the atheistic philosophy of Nietzsche and egalitarian philosophy of Marx. Here I should point out that Anton Chekhov, the Russian genius, also lived with tuberculosis for a long period of his life. As a result, he also had a very bleak and pessimistic view of life. Here I am comparing both Camus and Chekhov because they both turned the pessimism to optimism. Camus mostly through philosophy and Chekhov through storytelling. Not just that, both Camus and Chekhov were deeply interested and involved in theatre. In 1933, Camus entered the University of Algiers and not surprisingly, he studied philosophy and wrote his thesis on Plotinus, the ancient Egyptian born Greco Roman philosopher who, like Plato, emphasized ideas over matter and mind over body. Along with this, in his university thesis, Camus juxtaposed Christianity with ancient Greek philosophy, argued that Christian promise of afterlife made this life almost meaningless and redundant because you could die at birth and go straight to heaven. According to Camus, most religions doesn't value this life. They only treat this life as a test for afterlife. Camus understood that the Greeks, on the other hand, celebrated this life despite their belief in a divine power, and no surprise that Camus, just like Nietzsche, returned to ancient Greece to find a true atheistic meaning for life in one of his most famous works named The Myth of Sisyphus, which I will discuss later. Now let's discuss his achievements. Albert Camus received Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957, aged 44, making him second youngest writer ever to receive the prize after Rudyard Kipling, who was 41 in 1907. Death of Albert Camus. In 1960, while returning back from a holiday, the car he was traveling crashed into a tree, killing him instantly. In his pocket, the police found an unused train ticket to Paris, which means he was supposed to travel by train with his wife and kids, but for some reason he had chosen to travel by car. The car was driven by his publisher Gallimard, who also died in the crash. The police also found a 144 pages of manuscript of his novel in progress, named The First Man, an autobiographical novel about his life growing up in Algeria. Today, Albert Camus is considered one of the most influential novelist philosopher of 20th century. So now let's discuss some of the major works of Albert Camus, some of his novels, The Outsider, The Plague, The Fall, and some of his philosophical essays, The Myth of Sisyphus and The Rebel. And today I will discuss his one novel, The Fall, and one philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. The Fall. The Fall was published in 1956. It is the last complete novel by Albert Camus. The story is a confession of a fallen judge set in the cold of Paris and Amsterdam. Camus is a lawyer in Paris. He is at the top of his game. He has got money, fame, and power. But one night he witnesses a woman committing suicide by jumping into a river. He does nothing to stop. He goes home and forgets it. Days go by, then weeks, then months, and then years. But the incident has left a dent in him, like a hole in his soul. Despite his best effort to forget it, he feels something inside. Every time there is a negative incident happening to him, he goes back to that night. A kind of superstition, like a cancer cell, grows inside him that all the negative things that happen to him can be attributed to his failure to do the right thing that night, which means helping the woman. It gets to the point that he questions himself. His whole life he has been nothing but selfish. Every good deed he has done has been for his own selfishness. Not only that, he also wanted to inflict terrible things onto the others. At least he thought about inflicting pain onto the others. His shiny surface life hides a sinister and dark hidden side where he is nothing but a terrible person, just like in Oscar Wilde's novel The Picture of Dorian Gray. Upon realization, his whole shiny castle of himself crumbles inside him. He stops working. Soon he can no longer keep it. Tolstoy said, "Disillusioned men join wars." He considers joining French resistance against the Germans but sees no point in that. He decides to flee from Paris to London but takes a route through North Africa where the issue of religion and God come into focus. But despite him concluding that God is truly dead and life is truly meaningless, he came to a deeper realization that to be human in modern times is to be guilty. Yes, modern man is always condemned to be guilty. It has nothing to do with religion or God, it comes from within. That's where the novel ends. From this novel, we can analyze that the hero on the outside lived a successful life, but it was his own deeper psyche that turned against him. Just like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov's own inner torment forced him to confess that sealed his fate. The guilt of not saving the woman, the hero in the novel is forever condemned to feel guilty, but the protagonist is guilty not for his action but for his inaction. So, to be or not to be, or to do or not to do, either way, you are doomed. Now let's move to the one of the most philosophical essays of Albert Camus, The Myth of Sisyphus. The Myth of Sisyphus was published in 1942, in which he introduces his philosophy of absurdism. Sisyphus was a Greek titan who was condemned to push a boulder or rock up a mountain as a punishment from God. The boulder would fall down and he would have to go back down and push it back up the mountain, a process he repeats forever without any hope or change or stop, showing the futility and absurdity of life. So, absurdism simply means we humans seek meaning or purpose in life, but the universe has no answer for it. Camus' ultimate answer through this essay is to understand and accept the absurdity of life like Sisyphus. Every time he goes down to get the boulder, he understands the futility of his life, but he accepts it. He doesn't stop but pushes the boulder for eternity. Camus argued the absurdity of life makes it even more worth living. For Camus, life's happiness is not in its meaning or purpose, but in the struggles of life itself. In other words, we find joy not in life being easy or a straight path, instead, our truest joys come from life being a struggle, contradictions, and absurd. Then Camus concludes his essay with a quote: "The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because he accepts the absurdity of life." Now let's delve into the main philosophy of Albert Camus, for which he is still famous for, the philosophy of absurdism. जब हम किसी भी फ़िलॉसफ़ी के इज़म को समझने की कोशिश करते हैं तो वो जवाब देता है उन गहरे फ़िलॉसफ़ी के सवालात का जो अक्सर हमारे दिलों और जहन में जन्म लेते हैं, जैसे कि ज़िंदगी का मकसद क्या है, हम क्यों ज़िंदा हैं, हम क्यों ज़िंदगी में वजूद लाए हैं, इस दुनिया का पर्पस क्या है, हमारा पर्पस क्या है, वगैरह। मैंने अपनी वीडियो के आगाज़ में एक फ़लसफ़े का जिक्र किया था जिसे नीट्शे ने दिया है द फ़िलॉसफ़ी ऑफ निहिलिज़म। जो निहिलिज़म का फ़लसफ़ा है वो कहता है कि ज़िंदगी का कोई एक्चुअल पर्पस नहीं है, ज़िंदगी की कोई एक्चुअल माना नहीं है, हमारे होने ना होने से इस दुनिया को कोई फ़र्क नहीं पड़ता। तो फिर इस फ़लसफ़े के जवाब में एक और फ़लसफ़ा मिलता है एग्जिस्टेंशलिज़म। एग्जिस्टेंशलिज़म का फ़लसफ़ा कहता है कि हाँ, बड़े पैमाने में ज़िंदगी की कोई कलेक्टिव मीनिंग नहीं है, कोई कलेक्टिव पर्पस नहीं है, पर फिर भी हम अपनी अपनी ज़िंदगी का मकसद खुद डिसाइड कर सकते हैं सब्जेक्टिवली। निहिलिज़म के फ़लसफ़े को टैकल करने के लिए हमारे पास एक फ़लसफ़ा आता है जो है एब्सर्डिज़म। बेसिकली द वर्ड एब्सर्ड मीन्स इलॉजिकल, रिडिकुलस और नॉनसेंस। सिंपली कोई भी बेतुकी बात, जैसे कि कोई आपके पास आता है और कहता है कि मैं आसमान में उड़ सकता हूँ और आप उसको कहोगे ये तुम क्या बेतुकी बातें कर रहे हो। बिल्कुल वैसे ही एब्सर्डिज़म का फ़लसफ़ा कहता है कि क्या तुम बेतुके सवालात लेकर बैठे हो ज़िंदगी के मकसद के बारे में, जबकि ये दुनिया तो है ही लॉजिकल। जब ये दुनिया ही लॉजिकल है तो तुम क्या उसके अंदर अपना मकसद ढूंढने की कोशिश कर रहे हो। हाँ, इंसान के दिल में कुछ ऐसे पैशंस और ख्वाहिशात होती हैं कि जिसकी बिना पे वो अपनी ज़िंदगी के गोल्स, मीनिंग्स या मकसद डिसाइड करता है। पर सच ये भी तो है कि ये दुनिया है ही पर्पसलेस, मीनिंगलेस, और इस सिचुएशन को फेमस राइटर अल्बर्ट कैम्यू ने टर्म दिया है दी एब्सर्ड, जिसकी सिंपल सी मिसाल ये है कि मुझे एक तरफ फ़लाँ काम करना भी है, पर मैं ये भी जानता या जानती हूँ कि इस काम को करने का कोई एक्चुअल फ़ायदा नहीं मिलेगा मुझे। तो अब क्या? कैसे इस एब्सर्डिटी को एक्सेप्ट किया जाए, कैसे इस एब्सर्डिटी से बाहर आया जाए? तो इसके लिए अल्बर्ट कैम्यू ने हमें 3 रास्ते दिए हैं। नंबर 1, सेल्फ डिस्ट्रक्ट, सिंपली जीना ही छोड़ दो, मीन्स सुसाइड कर लो। पर ऑब्वियसली ये रास्ता कोई सही रास्ता तो नहीं है, तो इसके जवाब में हमें वो सेकंड ऑप्शन देते हैं, लीप ऑफ फेथ, जिसका सिंपली माना है किसी भी आइडियोलॉजी या रिलीजन को फॉलो करो, एक्सेप्ट करो। और हम सब ही जानते हैं कि रिलीजन हमारी ज़िंदगियों को जीने का एक अहम मकसद देता है, पर अल्बर्ट कैम्यू के हिसाब से ऐसा करने से हम अपनी खुद की फ्रीडम को रोक रहे हैं, हम अपनी खुद की फ्रीडम को बाउंड करते हैं। तो उन्होंने इसके जवाब में हमें थर्ड ऑप्शन दिया जो कि उनके लिए बेस्ट ऑप्शन है, और वो है इम्ब्रेस। उन्होंने कहा कि एब्सर्डिटी को अपनाओ, इम्ब्रेस करो, फिर तुम सही मायने में फ्री होगे और फिर तुम जो चाहोगे वो कर सकते होगे अपनी ज़िंदगी में। और इसकी मिसाल उन्होंने द मिथ ऑफ सिसिफस में भी दी कि जैसे सिसिफस ने अपनी एब्सर्डिटी को एक्सेप्ट कर लिया था, अपनी सज़ा को एक्सेप्ट कर लिया था और हैप्पीली अपनी जॉब को सरअंजाम दिया था। तो कैम्यू कहते हैं कि इंसान की ज़िंदगी भी सिसिफस की तरह है, जैसे कि वो उस पत्थर को धकेल के ऊपर लेके जाता है, फिर वापस वो पत्थर नीचे आता है, पर अगेन वो उस पत्थर को दोबारा ऊपर ले जाता है। तो ऐसे ही हम अपनी ज़िंदगियों को भी धक्का मार रहे हैं, जबकि हमें पता है कि ज़िंदगी का कोई असल मकसद नहीं है, यहाँ पे सब कुछ पॉइंटलेस है, क्योंकि इन दी एंड हमें मौत आनी ही आनी है। तो सब कुछ यहाँ पे पॉइंटलेस है, ये दुनिया और हम सारे इंसान इस दुनिया में रहने वाले। पर अल्बर्ट कैम्यू कहते हैं कि जिस दिन हम अपनी एब्सर्डिटी को एक्सेप्ट कर लेंगे तो हम स्ट्रगल्स में भी खुश रहना सीखेंगे, और अल्बर्ट कैम्यू के मुताबिक रियल हैप्पीनेस है ही स्ट्रगल्स में। तो ये था अल्बर्ट कैम्यू का जाना माना मशहूर फ़लसफ़ा द फिलॉसफी ऑफ एब्सर्डिज्म। I will tell you all the major concepts of Albert Camus. Number 1. The absurd. The absurd is a conflict between the human tendency to seek inherent value and meaning in life and the human inability to find any meaning in a purposeless, meaningless, and irrational universe, with the unreasonable silence of the universe in response. You can define absurd like water slipping through one's fingers. However, this world in itself is not absurd. What's absurd is our relationship with the universe, which is irrational. The absurd depends as much on man as on the world. It is all that links them together. Thus, universe and human mind don't each separately cause the absurd, but rather the absurd arises by the contradictory nature of the two existing simultaneously. Concept number 2. The revolt. Revolt is an essential concept of Albert Camus. Basically, it is the maintenance of a lucid awareness of the absurdity of life. To revolt is to say no to one's own absurd existence and in the process say yes to some other more desirable existence. As Camus quote, one of the only coherent philosophical positions is thus revolt. Concept number 3. The rebel. In his philosophical essay, The Rebel, Albert Camus gave the concept of rebellion, which is about standing up against unfair and oppressive situations. He believed that when faced with injustice or absurdity, people should consciously defy these conditions. Rebellion for Camus is both an individual and collective act, involving a moral choice to reject dehumanizing circumstances. It is not just chaotic protest, it is a responsible and ethical stance. Camus warns against replacing one form of tyranny with another and emphasizes the creation of personal values in the face of life's lack of inherent meaning. As Albert Camus quote, in order to exist, man must rebel, but rebellion must respect the limits that it discovers in itself. Conclusion. Camus dedicated his life to writing novels and essays in an attempt to find a non religious meaning. He finally settled on a simple idea that life is not about finding meaning but being content or even happy that it has no meaning. It is liberating to know that there is no grand purpose we have to adhere to or be bound by. He found his purpose in playing football, writing stories and essays, producing plays, inspiring others, and pushing boundaries of human intellect. It doesn't matter which destination you have in mind, it is the dedication that matters, the process, the work itself. Like Sisyphus does the most futile job in the world, pushing a boulder up a mountain knowing that it would fall back down, but he takes the job on the chin and keeps pushing. The water starts stinking when it stops moving. So life is meant to be lived to the fullest. Push as hard as you can, and that should bring you joy and contentment. Thank you for listening.